do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
We left.
more of a community.
Before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Oscar Wilde once said, "I regard the theater as the greatest of all art forms, the most immediate way in which a human being can share with another the sense of what it is to be a human being." English writer and director Trevis has dedicated her career to that greatest of all art forms. She was the first woman to run a company at Britain's Royal National Theatre and has worked extensively at the Royal Shakespeare Company. In 2001, Trevis co-authored a stage adaptation of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, which was hailed as ravishing and received an Olivier Award. Trevis's international workshops have helped dedicated actors throughout Europe, Cuba, and the U.S. hone their craft. Her soon-to-be-published book, Being a Director, A Life in the Theatre, chronicles her career. Here's our conversation with Trevis. Trevis, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for asking me.
In your book, Being a Director, A Life in the Theatre, which comes out in July, you say that becoming a director does not work like any other profession. You say your working life will be a jolting, hardly controlled, bumpy ride, often downhill. Not that that should dishearten you.
Well, to be a director, to be paid for directing plays, is a very difficult thing to achieve. I mean, you can direct plays, but whether you can earn your living doing it is another question. You know, many are called, but few are chosen, it seems to me. But it is a very fantastic career if you can get it. The marvellous thing about being in times of economic deterioration at the moment is that you're joined by thousands of other people who did have a secure career and now are feeling quite insecure. So in a way, you're just like everybody else at the moment, so you might as well do what you want.
Now, you went into theater after 8 years of acting, and it almost happened overnight with the switch of a switch. Someone suggested to you that you really ought to be a director, and that sit well with you, and you said yes, and that's what you pursued.
Well, I loved acting, and I had quite a good career as an actress on the whole. I mean, I only had one period of unemployment. But, you know, I made a television film for Stephen Frears, and I acted in a Tennessee Williams play in the West End of London, and I went to the National Theatre. But after 8 years, I began to feel that it wasn't so much acting that made me unhappy as the acting life. I often say that I felt like a woman twice over, that in those days, being an actress was involved a certain amount of passivity, taking instructions, and in getting jobs and in appearing on the stage, you really had to be pleasing. You know, it's a woman's job to be pleasing. And that was echoed in society too. And so I felt like a woman twice over, and I felt that suddenly the idea of no woman directed, you know, in those days. But I felt that to be a woman director would be an amazing and exciting thing, although it was absolutely terrifying. And so I made that decision suddenly one day, walking disconsolate and depressed and heartbroken in Portobello Road in London. And I sort of have never looked back.
And you have great respect and great empathy for actors. And in fact, when I read about casting calls and your approach to that and your approach to working with actors and unlocking their talent, I thought, if I were an actor, you're the director I'd want to work under.
Well, that's very nice of you. I mean, I do get on very well with actors. I do respect them enormously, and I hate the cultural assumption that they're sort of worthless and narcissistic and silly people, really. Because Lorca said that theatre is the barometer of a country's greatness, and he was right. And actors are artists, and they're called to their profession, and they sacrifice a great deal to be actors. And a great actor is a most wonderful and useful member of society. And I think we ought to get off thinking of them as lovers and so on, because it's a very harsh discipline. An actor really has the discipline of a soldier, and it's a wonderful life. It's wonderfully companionable and exciting in many ways, but it's also a dedicated life, and I respect that in actors.
I have a new appreciation, I think, for the life of a director. It seems to me stressful, all-consuming, that you must at all times project a sense of calm. You write in your book, forget the clock and be controlled by it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, one has to have enormous powers of organisation, because, you know, there's a deadline to further travel along the analogy of soldiers. I mean, you go over the top at a certain time on a certain day, and everything has to be ready by then, hopefully.
You say you need one set of skills for directing and another set of skills to be a director.
That's right. You have to sit in a room and absolutely concentrate on the actors and wait for that moment when, well, inspiration comes or a breakthrough comes or a use of technique then reveals some kind of spontaneity. And at the same time, you have to know that, you know, another group of actors are arriving to do their scene in an hour. So you have to have two aspects. You have to have two highly trained psychological characteristics. You have to be able to organise, to keep together a team, to talk to your technicians, to run on time. And the other side of it is a very sensitive, concentrated, imaginative side. You could say that one is a sort of male type of thinking and one is a female type of thinking, or sometimes people refer to it as a right-hand and left-hand side of the brain. But you have to have a good balance of both.
Well, speaking of a female kind of thing, you were the first woman to lead a theatre company at the Royal National Theatre.
That's right.
What do you think women bring to the theatre that men didn't?
Well, the viewpoint of 52% of the audience. It's a 52% of the audience are women. And, you know, one brings, I suppose, the understanding of that other half of the population. It's no coincidence, perhaps, that in the theatre worked a lot of really feminised, as it were, men before women started working in the theatre. And that's because they could appreciate and understand in some way the female point of view. But there's nothing like getting it from the horse's mouth. I mean, the way a man would direct Yerma, which is about a woman yearning to have a baby, and the way I direct it must really be different. That's not to say that I can't direct, you know, Macbeth, which is about a male murderer, because I do understand murderous feelings. Nobody who directs a play like that actually has to go and commit a murder to know what it's like. But you have to have access to those feelings.
Speaking of having a baby, you write in your book about your young daughter being strolled with a nanny past the opera house, and she says, at the time I should say, that you were in the middle of a production at the National Theatre and also working on an opera, and she said, "That's an opera house, that's where my mother lives."
I know, broke my heart, really. I mean, I'd waited for years to have a baby, and then when I had the baby, did I adore her? I mean, nobody adores that child more than I do. But I was bored by motherhood. I missed the companionship of the theatre. I missed the whole, as the Irish say, crack of it. And I struggled to get back to the theatre. And when I got back, I took everything that was offered me. So I did find myself at a certain point in her life, you know, working hours and hours and hours. And I had not only Arturo Uir, played by Brecht, at the National Theatre. That had about 22 people in it. I also did the equivalent of a sort of modern Wagnerian opera at the Opera House. And so I used to drive home so exhausted, every muscle in my body aching, and I used to see that the light was still on in her nursery, which I could see from the road. And I used to sit in the car until it was switched off, because sadly I just couldn't then cope with a tired child, you know, and it seemed to me a great pity. So I stopped work after that for a little while, so that she would know that actually I lived at home.
It seems to me that the directing has some bittersweet elements as well, and I say that because you say that actors have this unspeakable, unspoken camaraderie that you will not be a part of. And you talked about visiting your production, you will see that it has subtly grown away from you, like a child that you've released into the world.
Exactly. I mean, this very subtle thing starts to happen. As you put the actors on the stage, they start to congregate in the dressing room and the green room, and you're busy with the technicians. You have your job, they have their job. And then they face the audience, which is, you know, undeniably nerve-wracking. And that gives them a fantastic camaraderie, the analogy of the soldier again. They look out for each other and they start to have this common experience of going out there in front of the audience. And you are very politely excluded from it. You've had all the camaraderie of the rehearsal room, but when you go back to the dressing rooms, they're nice to you, a bit like a child is when you go on a visit to university. They're sort of nice to you, but they can't wait for you to go. No, that's right. That's right.
But the other thing you said that just struck me, success oddly is more difficult to get over than failure.
Yes, it's I had a massive success in a play in the West End of London, and I played it for 8 months and then it stopped, and really my career had completely turned around. I was in a very much better position, and I would say I almost had a nervous breakdown. I mean, I was very, very depressed afterwards, and I noticed that when I had an enormous success with the Remembrance of Things Past, the Proust at the National Theatre, I felt quite depleted afterwards. You see, success is so transitory in the theatre, so that it's all to do again, straight away. If people haven't seen it, it's not there. So everything you do is ephemeral, and you can never bank on a success. I mean, what people say is, you've had a marvellous success, so I suppose now you're going to be out of work for a year. I mean, that's what happens to actors, you know. And you haven't quite got the energy to start again, but you jolly well have to start again, otherwise nothing will happen.
In fact, that's what you say is the difficult part, is keep on keeping on.
To keep on keeping on. You see, lots of people were interested in me when I was a young director, you know, because people are hungry for the new. It's part of our culture that the new is adored and the old is not revered at all. And what I found interesting is that once you're not young, a young director, and especially, dare I say it, if you're not a young woman, then you are faced with building an entire career, and people think they know you, they know your measure, they've got you, they've heard about you, and so you have to summon a great deal of stamina to go on going on. I mean, it's a bit like having had a child, your children grow up and go, and then you're faced, as a woman, aren't you, you're faced with, well, what am I for? What am I supposed to do now? This very important element in my life has gone. Well, that's a bit like having a success. You don't roll on. I mean, you know, you enjoy it and everything, but you learn to distrust success as much as you distrust so-called failure.
You teach actors all over the world, in Germany and France, in Cuba,
Yes.
in the United States, and in fact you were here at Penn State
Yes.
working with graduate and undergraduate students for Penn State Center Stage in the production of Beau Stratagem. Is it different working with student actors in France than it is in the US, or in England than American actors?
Well, there is a slight difference. There is a sort of cultural difference. There's a difference in the way actors are regarded in England and in Europe and in America. But the actual process of acting is exactly the same. And what I always say, I was in Vienna recently, I was doing a production of Romeo and Juliet. And backstage there I met a technician, you know, and I said to him, we speak a common language, we speak theatre. I mean, that's what, so when you go backstage in theatres in Europe, or you work with actors, it's all the same jokes, it's the same camaraderie. I found the same thing in Romania. You know, theatre's sort of the same the world over. The love of it and the enjoyment of it and the talent. I mean, just culturally in America, I think actors are slightly less respected, and they are treated by those in control of them much more as a commodity. And I find that distressing.
Many would say that Western drama, all Western drama, stands on the shoulders of Shakespeare. When did Shakespeare get into your grips?
Oh, well, I was born near Shakespeare's town. It was a very different town. I was born in a big industrial city called Birmingham. But I went to Stratford quite often as a child, not to the theatre, because my father was a fisherman. He went to fish in the river and to look at cricket matches and so on. So I saw this theatre and I heard this name. My father, in many ways a difficult man, loved Shakespeare and knew reams of it by heart, although, you know, he'd left school very early and was what you call not educated. But he loved poetry. He used to recite Gray's Elegy and recite bits of Shakespeare to me. So I really knew it from an early age. I was an avid reader, hungry for books. And I started to read Shakespeare, I suppose, at about 11 or 12. And I just thought it was marvellous. You know, Coriolanus says at one point, there is a world elsewhere. And that's really what Shakespeare was for me.
Because you were escaping your home.
I was escaping.
Your father.
I was escaping my father, and then the ugliness of my surroundings, the crudeness of the relationships I discovered there, the very unspiritual atmosphere, and the atmosphere of material lack and no sort of inner resources. And so Shakespeare for me was the spirit, beauty, the world of other people.
What's interesting to me about that is for others, Shakespeare was hated. He was too difficult, too irreverent, or irrelevant rather.
Yes.
And here you are, 12, 13, 14 years old, and he's speaking to you.
Well, lots of writers spoke to me. I mean, not only Shakespeare, the poets spoke to me. I'll never forget going up to a teacher when I was very young, about 12, and saying, I think I've understood what's happening with poets, you know. And she said, oh, you've understood, have you, what's happening with poets? And I said, I think they're aware that life is short and ends in death, and I think that their poetry is a mark against that. And she looked absolutely gobsmacked. But I had this thought, do you know, I was aware. I was also good at English, so I didn't find it difficult, and I found it exciting to look up the words or to ask somebody to explain things to me. I mean, I read accessible things too at that time. You know, I read Hemingway, I read accessible things too.
Now, your father died at 52 of cancer. You describe him as kind of an angry brute, someone you and your mother and your brothers were afraid of. But he never got to see that you made it to the Royal National Theatre.
No.
What do you think he would have thought of that?
You know, I think he would have been, proud. I think he would have understood maybe that, it sounds so arrogant of me, but he would have understood that, you know, I was difficult, but that was because I had a special sensitivity, you know, and maybe that special sensitivity was in fact his. He had a tragic life, I think, and I think he was thwarted, and I think he was in a loveless marriage. And you see that so much in that generation. You know, he had to leave school early because his father died, and he never really found any kind of work that satisfied him. He didn't have a good relationship with my mother. He didn't understand his children. He lost his faith. You know, it's very hard for him.
You're married to a composer, Dominic Muldowney, and in fact he worked as, I think, the music director for the National Theatre.
Yeah, he was the music director at 22.
Oh my goodness. So the first woman and probably the youngest music director, I'm guessing. It seems to me to be a very collaborative relationship.
Yes.
I saw his side notes on your memoir to be published in July, and I thought how lovingly it was edited.
Well, yes, it is a collaborative partnership. We met quite late for me. I'd had a lot of unhappiness, and you know, it was like sailing into port. It was wonderful for me to meet Dominic. He provided all the intellectual stimulation. His social background in London was a background that I deeply wanted to be part of. You know, he knew Hockney, he knew Brecht's translator, he knew all the leading composers. It was very exciting for me to be in a milieu that I wanted at last. And he is a very brilliant man and a very troubled man in many ways, but he has a sweetness of nature that's simply undeniable, and so we've managed to have a long marriage, whatever that means.
Well, another important man in your life is Harold Pinter. You mentioned a remembrance of things past.
Also a brilliant and difficult man.
Yes, and someone of course, he died in 2008. But
yes, I don't know how he dared do that. He certainly didn't want to.
Now, you collaborated with him on bringing the 7 volumes of Marcel Proust to the theatre. I don't even know how you can take 7 volumes and turn it into a 2-hour play. That had to have been one of the most challenging things you've ever done.
It was challenging for me to take the screenplay and put it on stage, but not as challenging, after all, as it was for Harold Pinter, who had to read Proust. He loved Proust. It took him a year. So it was a year's work before he put pen to paper, and then he was faced with a blank page. And he said to me, Joseph Losey said, Harold, just write something. Very good advice. And he just started to write. And he's very, very good at screenplays, Harold, I thought. Extremely good at adaptation, and so it was his achievement, really.
Well, as a teacher, you've said, I don't want to be known as a be-all, end-all type of director and acting teacher. You don't want, you said, in fact, I would, if someone were to call me I'm a Trevis actor, I'll kill you. That's how violently you disliked that whole notion. And there are actors who say, I'm a Meisner actor.
Yeah, yeah. Poor old Meisner, I would say, having the name taken in vain. I don't like gurus, and I think this idea that there's a technique for an actor is simply a way of marketing something. It's about money. I think every actor has to take what he can from the ideas available and come up really with his, or of course her, own method. And I'm just happy to have been part of the great tradition of the theatre and to have been able to spend my life in it. That's really so great for me that I'd hate to be, you know, marketed.
Di Trevis, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Di Trevis. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find additional clips from this interview. I'm Patty Satalia. Join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
If you've enjoyed Conversations from Penn State and would like to purchase a DVD of this show or any of our other episodes, order online at mediasales.psu.edu or call 1-800-770-2111.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.